February 16, 1979. Dawn has not yet broken over Tehran. A man walks across an airport tarmac in a dark overcoat. Generals flank him on both sides. His shoes click against the wet concrete. The air smells of jet fuel and cold winter fog. He does not speak. He does not wave. He does not look back at the city glowing faintly behind him. His face carries the expression of a man who has already said goodbye to something he cannot name. This is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shah of Iran, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans. He has ruled this country for 38 years. And now, in the grey silence of a winter morning, he is leaving it forever. Somewhere in the city behind him, 40 million people are awake. They are not sleeping, not on this night. The streets hum with a sound that is not quite celebration and not quite rage. It is something older than both. Something that rises from deep in the chest and does not have a clean name in any language. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. The Shah boards the plane. Behind him, his Empress Farah Pahlavi takes her seat. She was born Farah Diba in Tehran in 1938. She studied architecture in Paris. She married the Shah in December 1959 and became the first woman ever crowned empress in Iranian history. She had built schools, championed the arts, walked through villages, and held the hands of women who had never shaken the hand of a queen. And now she sits in a plane seat with her hands folded in her lap, and the city she loves falls away beneath the clouds. There are tears on her face. She does not wipe them. Their eldest son, Reza, had already left. Born in Tehran in 1960, officially named Crown Prince during his father's coronation in 1967, he had moved to the United States to train as a pilot with the Imperial Iranian Air Force. He was 18 years old when the world his family had built began to come apart. He would grow up in exile, in the Washington area, watching from a distance as everything changed. The plane lifts off. Iran disappears below the clouds, and a dynasty that had ruled for 38 years, that had called itself the heir to 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, is gone in the time it takes to climb to cruising altitude. How does a throne like that collapse? Not in a day, not in a single moment of rebellion. Empires do not fall like trees, clean and sudden. They fray. They crack from the inside. They bleed out slowly across years and decades until one morning, a man in a dark overcoat walks across a tarmac and does not look back, and everyone watching knows it is finished. To understand what ended on that tarmac in 1979, you have to go back, far back. Further than the Shah's father, Reza Shah, who founded the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925. Further than the Qajar kings who came before him. Further than the Safavids and the Mongols and the Arabs who swept across this land in the 7th century. You have to go back to the beginning of what Iran actually is, which means going back to a plateau in the middle of the ancient world, ringed by mountains, cut through by rivers, where people settled and built and dreamed and conquered on a scale that still staggers the imagination. The land we call Iran sits at the center of everything. It always has. To the west, Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. To the east, the routes that wind toward India and China. To the north, the steppes where nomadic peoples gathered their horses and their ambitions. To the south, the Persian Gulf, shimmering and ancient, opening onto the sea lanes of the world. Whoever controlled this plateau controlled the crossroads of the known world. And the people who built their civilization here knew exactly what they had. The name Iran comes from the ancient word Aryana, meaning land of the Aryans, referring to the Indo-Iranian peoples who settled the plateau thousands of years before the birth of Christ. The Greeks called it Persia, after the region of Pars in the southwest, where the greatest of the ancient dynasties would eventually rise. but the people who lived here always called it Iran. That name carries something in it, a weight, a continuity, a sense that this place has always been exactly what it is, regardless of who sits on the throne or what flag flies above the palace gates. And what a palace it was! When the Achaemenid Empire rose in the 6th century before the Common Era, it did not just build a kingdom. It built the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, it stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to Anatolia in the west, from Egypt in the south to the edges of Central Asia in the north. Tens of millions of people lived under its rule. Dozens of languages were spoken within its borders. And at the center of it all stood a king who called himself Shahanshah, King of Kings. The same title that Muhammad Reza Pahlavi would claim for himself in 1967, more than 2,000 years later. He was not being modest about the comparison. That continuity mattered. It mattered enormously. When the Shah staged his famous celebrations at Persepolis in 1971, marking 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, he was doing something very deliberate. He was drawing a straight line from Cyrus the Great to himself. He was saying, "This throne is ancient. This civilization is eternal. And I am its living expression." But Iran had not been only that throne. It had been something else for more than 1,000 years. In the 7th century of the Common Era, Arab armies swept across the Persian plateau carrying a new faith. Islam arrived not as a gentle suggestion, but as a conquering force, and the Zoroastrian civilization that had defined Persian identity for centuries was transformed forever. The old fire temples dimmed, the Arabic script replaced the ancient Persian, and the people of this plateau became, over generations, deeply and genuinely Muslim. Not erased, never erased. The Persian language survived. Persian poetry survived. Persian art and architecture and philosophy survived, and in many ways flourished, absorbing and transforming the new faith rather than simply being absorbed by it. The great poets, Rumi, Hafiz, Ferdowsi, wrote in Persian. They wrote about love and God and the nature of the soul with a richness that had no equal anywhere in the medieval world. Iran became Islamic and remained Persian at the same time. It held both things at once. That tension between the pre-Islamic Persian identity and the Islamic faith is not a modern invention. It is the oldest argument in Iranian culture, and in 1979 it exploded. The Shah had leaned hard into the Persian side of that tension. He had pushed a program of rapid modernization he called the White Revolution. He had promoted Western culture, Western dress, Western industry. He had named himself Arya Meha, Light of the Aryans, reaching back past Islam to something older and more ancient. His court glittered with European fashions. His secret police, the Savak, crushed dissent with methods that left marks on bodies and on memory alike. Repression and torture were not rumors. They were policy. And across the country, in the mosques and the bazaars and the universities, something was building. It was not one thing. It was many things pressed together until they became a single force. There were the religious faithful, who felt their values had been trampled by a westernizing king who cared more for Persepolis than for the prophet. There were the leftists and the intellectuals who had watched the CIA help restore the Shah to power in 1953 after a democratically elected prime minister was overthrown, and who had never forgiven it. There were the merchants of the bazaar, squeezed by economic policies that favored foreign investment over Iranian commerce. There were students, there were clerics, there were ordinary people who simply felt that something had been taken from them and they wanted it back. Ruhollah Khomeini had been in exile since 1964. He was a cleric of immense authority and iron will, and the Shah had expelled him for speaking too loudly against the government. He spent years in Iraq, then briefly in France, broadcasting his voice back into Iran on cassette tapes that passed from hand to hand in the darkness. His message was simple and total. The Shah was a tyrant. The monarchy was illegitimate. Iran must return to God. and millions of people, for 100 different reasons, were ready to hear it. On January 7, 1978, protests began. Over the following 13 months, they grew. They swelled. They became something unprecedented in modern history. A popular revolution without a conventional army, driven by sheer weight of human will, toppling one of the most heavily armed governments in the Middle East. The Shah's forces fired on crowds. People died, and more people came. In the Islamic tradition of mourning the dead on the 40th day, each massacre produced a new demonstration 40 days later, larger than the one before, a rhythm of grief and resistance that no amount of force could break. On February 1, 1979, Khomeini's Air France flight touched down in Tehran. The crowds waiting for him were beyond counting. Some estimates placed the number at 3 million people. The air smelled of rosewater and bodies pressed together in the cold. The sound of their voices was not like a crowd at the stadium or a rally. It was something closer to a force of nature, a roar that seemed to come from the ground itself. He stepped off the plane, an old man in black robes, and the world changed. 10 days later, on February 11th, the last remnants of the imperial government collapsed. The revolution was complete. 2,500 years of monarchy, or at least the idea of 2,500 years of monarchy, was over in a single season. Back on that tarmac on February 16th, the Shah's plane climbs into a sky that is beginning to lighten. He holds no country. He carries no throne. He is 59 years old, and he will be dead within 18 months of cancer, in exile in Egypt, never having returned to the land where he was born. His empress weeps. His son watches from America. And in the streets of Tehran below, a new Iran is being born in real time, screaming and furious and full of a joy that is already, even now, beginning to curdle at the edges. Because here is what the celebrations in the streets did not yet reveal. The revolution that toppled the Shah was not a single movement. It was the collision of 3 irreconcilable visions of what Iran should become. And in the chaos of victory, those visions were about to turn against each other with devastating force. One of them would win, 2 would be annihilated, and Iran would never be the same. While the Shah's plane disappeared into European airspace, millions of Iranians gathered in the streets of Tehran. They waved photographs, not of Khomeini, not yet, but of someone else. Ancient coins, carved stone reliefs. The face of a man who had been dead for 2,300 years, Cyrus the Great. In that moment, Iranians were not just rejecting their last king, they were summoning the ghost of their first. That tells you something important. To understand why a modern revolution reaches back 25 centuries for its symbols, you have to go there. You have to cross the threshold of time itself and stand in a world where Persia was not a memory, where it was the center of everything. Picture the Iranian plateau around 550 years before the Common Era. Dry mountains, cold nights that cut through wool like a blade, the smell of dust and livestock and cook fires. This is the world Cyrus the Great was born into, somewhere around 600 years before the Common Era, in a region called Persis in the southwest of modern Iran. He was a prince of a small dynasty, the Achaemenids. His people were subjects of the Median Empire, powerful and entrenched. Nobody watching that plateau in those years would have predicted what was about to happen. Cyrus looked at the empire above him and moved against it. He defeated the Medes, not just in one battle, but decisively, permanently. He absorbed their territory, their soldiers, their administrative systems, and then he kept going, west into Lydia, whose king Croesus was legendary for his wealth, then south and east, into Babylonia, into lands that stretched toward the Indus Valley, into Anatolia, into Mesopotamia, into the territories we would today call Iraq, Turkey, Egypt's borderlands, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. By the time he was finished, Cyrus had built the largest empire the world had ever seen, not by a small margin, by an enormous one. 5.5 million square kilometers, from the Balkans in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the edges of Cyrenaica in North Africa. Nothing like it had existed before. Nothing would match it for generations. But here is the part that gets lost when people talk about ancient empires. The size is almost beside the point. What Cyrus did with that size is what matters. He walked into Babylon in 539 years before the Common Era, and he did something conquerors simply did not do. He let people go home. The Jews held captive in Babylon. Since Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns, he freed them. He let them return to Jerusalem. He let them rebuild their temple. The Hebrew Bible calls him the Lord's Anointed, a pagan Persian king. Think about that. A clay cylinder from his reign, now held in the British Museum, records his policies in his own words. He allowed conquered peoples to worship their own gods. He returned stolen idols to their temples. He did not burn cities. He did not have to burn. This was not softness. It was strategy of a kind the ancient world had rarely seen. An empire that does not humiliate its subjects does not have to spend all its energy suppressing revolts. Cyrus built something that could actually last. He died around 530 years before the Common Era, fighting in Central Asia. His tomb still stands at Pasargadae in southern Iran, a simple stone platform, a small chamber on top. For a man who ruled half the known world, it is almost shockingly modest. When Alexander the Great visited it centuries later, he ordered it restored and protected. Even the man who destroyed Persia recognized what Cyrus had built. The empire Cyrus founded did not die with him. His successors, Cambyses and then Darius the Great, expanded it further. Darius reorganized the whole administrative structure, dividing the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who answered to the king. He built roads. He standardized weights and measures. He created a postal system that could carry a message across thousands of kilometers in days. The Persian Royal Road stretched from Sardis in western Anatolia all the way to Susa. Mounted couriers rode in relays. The Greek historian Herodotus marveled at them. He wrote that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness kept them from their appointed rounds. That phrase, those exact words, still appears today on the main post office in New York City. The Ghost of Persia, carved into Manhattan. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire held something close to 44% of the entire world's population under its authority. No empire before or since has ever governed a larger share of humanity. When Persians looked out from their plateau, they did not see a kingdom. They saw the world, because for them it essentially was. And then came the Greeks, not all at once. The Persian wars of the early 5th century before the Common Era, the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, those were humiliations, but not catastrophes. Persia survived them. The empire continued. But they planted something in the Greek imagination. A story about freedom against tyranny, West against East, the small defiant city-states against the vast Persian machine. The Greeks told that story for generations, and eventually, one of their own would use it as justification for something that looked very much like revenge. Alexander of Macedon became king in 336 years before the Common Era. He was 20 years old. His father Philip had already unified Greece under Macedonian power. Alexander took that unified force and turned it east toward the largest empire in the world, and he simply did not stop. At Gaugamela, in 331 years before the Common Era, he met the Persian king Darius III on an open plain in what is now northern Iraq. The Persian army was enormous. Some ancient sources give numbers that strain credibility, but even conservative estimates place it far larger than Alexander's force. Darius had chariots with scythed wheels. He had war elephants. He had cavalry from across his vast empire. He had every advantage of numbers and terrain. Alexander charged the center. Personally, He led his companion cavalry straight at the gap between Persian units, driving toward Darius himself. And Darius fled. The king of the greatest empire on earth turned his chariot and ran from a 25-year-old Macedonian. His own men watched it happen. The battle dissolved into rout. The empire that had stood for 200 years cracked open in an afternoon. Alexander marched into Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid world, a city of such staggering beauty that even its ruins today, in the desert outside Shiraz, stop people in their tracks. Massive carved reliefs of tribute bearers from every corner of the empire, each figure distinct, each nation represented in its own dress and posture, stretch across stone staircases. The Gate of All Nations still stands. Enormous stone balls flank the entrance. The scale of it is meant to communicate something specific, that all roads lead here, that all peoples answer here, that this is the center. Alexander burned it. Whether deliberately or in a drunken celebration, the ancient sources disagree. But the fire was real. The smoke rose over Persepolis for days. The smell of burning cedar and ash and the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries drifted across the plateau. The Achaemenid dynasty, the line that ran from Cyrus through Darius through Xerxes, was finished. Darius III was murdered by his own courtiers shortly after. Alexander found his body on a road in northeastern Iran and reportedly wept over it, then gave him a royal burial. Even in destruction, there was a kind of recognition. Alexander knew what he had broken. He died in Babylon in 323 years before the Common Era, at 32 years old. His empire immediately fractured among his generals. The eastern portion, including Persia, fell to Seleucus, who founded the Seleucid Empire. Greek became the language of administration. Greek culture pressed itself onto Persian soil. Temples to Greek gods rose in Persian cities. For a century and a half, Persia existed under Greek rule, Greek aesthetics, Greek assumptions about the world. But Persian identity did not dissolve. It went underground. It survived in the villages and the highlands, in the old languages, in the Zoroastrian faith that Cyrus and Darius had practiced, in the memory of what had existed before. Memory is a form of resistance. The Persians had long memories. The Parthians, an Iranian people from the northeast, eventually pushed the Seleucids out in the mid-2nd century before the Common Era. Persian culture began to resurface. Then the Sasanian Empire, founded in 224 years of the Common Era, explicitly positioned itself as the restoration of Achaemenid glory. Sasanian kings carved their victories into cliffsides the same way Darius had. They used the same titles. They invoked the same history. The ghost of Cyrus was already being summoned, even then, 17 centuries before those crowds in Tehran. But the Sasanians faced a threat that no amount of imperial nostalgia could prepare them for. In 633 years of the Common Era, Arab armies carrying a new faith swept out of the Arabian Peninsula. They had defeated the Byzantine Empire at Yarmouk. Now they turned east. The Sasanian Empire, exhausted by decades of war with Byzantium, could not hold. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636, Sasanian forces were broken. At Nahavand in 642, the last major Persian army was destroyed. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled east, hunted through his own former empire, and was murdered by a miller near Merv in 651 years of the Common Era. Alone, betrayed. The dynasty that had claimed descent from the gods died in a grain mill. Islam swept across the Iranian plateau. The old Zoroastrian temples were repurposed or destroyed. The sacred fires that had burned for centuries were extinguished. Arabic became the language of religion, of law, of scholarship. Persian was not banned, but it was diminished. For generations, Iran existed not as an independent power, but as a province, a territory administered by the Arab Umayyad, and then Abbasid caliphates based in Damascus and Baghdad. And yet, Persian culture survived again. Persian poets wrote in Arabic and then reclaimed their own language. Persian administrators ran the caliphate's bureaucracy. Persian scholars translated Greek philosophy, preserved ancient knowledge, drove the intellectual flowering of the Islamic Golden Age. The conquered became indispensable to the conquerors. It was a different kind of survival than before, quieter, more intimate, more dangerous in some ways, because it required constant negotiation between what was being erased and what could be saved. Then came the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century, sweeping in from Central Asia. Then the Mongols in the 13th century, under Genghis Khan's generals, and then his grandson Hulagu, who sacked Baghdad in 1258 and put the last Abbasid caliph to death. Wave after wave after wave, each one crashing over the plateau, each one reshaping what it meant to be Persian. For over 1,000 years, Persia would be a kingdom without a crown, a civilization conquered again and again, by Greeks, by Arabs, by Turks, by Mongols. Each wave of invaders would try to erase Persian identity. Each time it would survive, but survival was not triumph. And by the time a new empire emerged from the ashes, the Safavid dynasty of the 16th century, Persia would be transformed beyond recognition, forced to wear the robes of a religion imposed by its conquerors. The question of what it meant to be Persian and what it meant to be Muslim, and whether those two things could coexist or would forever tear at each other, that question was not yet answered. It would take centuries more. And in some ways, it is still being answered today, in the streets of a city whose people once carried the face of a dead king through the smoke of a revolution, looking for something they could not quite name, something that had been lost for so long that no one alive had ever actually seen it. The search had been going on for centuries. Not a search with maps or armies, but something quieter and more desperate. A search for a way to remain yourself when everything around you is being rewritten. Persian scholars had found partial answers in bureaucracy, in poetry, in the careful preservation of language. But poetry alone cannot hold a civilization together, and bureaucracy bends to whoever holds the sword. What Persian needed was something deeper, something that could not be confiscated at a border or burned in a library. It needed a story about itself that was also somehow a story about God. It found one, but the finding took centuries of pain. When the Arab armies swept across the plateau in the 7th century, they did not just bring a new ruler, they brought a new cosmos. Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith that had shaped Persian identity since the Achaemenid kings, did not vanish overnight, but it bled. Slowly, generation by generation, the fire temples grew quieter. The prayers changed. The names of children changed. The old gods did not die in battle. They faded, the way a fire fades when no one tends it, until one morning you wake and the embers are cold. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the vast majority of Persia had converted to Islam, most of them to Sunni Islam, the faith of the Arab conquerors, the faith of the caliphs in Baghdad. And here was the wound that would not close. To be Muslim in that world was to accept, on some level, the spiritual authority of the Arabs. The language of prayer was Arabic. The founding stories of the faith were Arab stories. The holy cities were Arab cities. For a people who had once ruled the world, who had once looked down from Persepolis at the known universe laid out before them, this was not a small thing. Then the Seljuk Turks arrived, then the Mongols, and with each new wave of conquest, the question sharpened into something almost unbearable. What are we? If not our kings, if not our fire temples, if not our empire, then what? What is left of Persia when Persia itself has been erased? The answer came from an unlikely direction. It came from grief. Within Islam itself, a fracture had opened almost from the moment the Prophet Muhammad died in 632. The question was simple and savage. Who leads? Muhammad had no surviving sons, his companions argued, his family argued, and in the decades that followed, the community split. One group, who would become the Sunnis, accepted the succession of the caliphs chosen by community consensus. Another group, smaller and fiercer in their mourning, believed the leadership belonged by divine right to Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and to Ali's descendants. These were the Shia, the partisans of Ali. In 680, at a place called Karbala in what is now Iraq, Ali's son Hussein led a small band of followers against the army of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid. He was outnumbered beyond all reason. He knew it. His followers knew it. They rode out anyway, into the dust and the heat of the Iraqi desert, and they were slaughtered. Hussein was killed on the 10th day of the month of Muharram. His head was taken. His family was taken captive. The smell of that battlefield, blood and desert dust, and the smoke of burning tents did not leave the Shia imagination. It never has. Karbala became the center of a universe built around righteous suffering, around the idea that the good are killed by the powerful, that injustice is the nature of this world, and that to stand against it, even knowing you will lose, is the highest act of faith. Now, hold that story in your mind, and look at what Persia had been living through for 1,000 years. Wave after wave of conquest, humiliation after humiliation, the good people ground down by the powerful, the rightful rulers displaced by usurpers. If you were Persian, searching for a religious framework that matched your actual experience of history, Shia Islam was not just a theological option. It was a mirror. It reflected exactly what you had been living. The suffering was not meaningless. It was sacred. Resistance was not futile. It was holy. This is the genius that one young man in the early 16th century saw with absolute clarity. His name was Ismail. He was 14 years old when he led his first military campaign. 14. He belonged to the Safavid order, a Sufi brotherhood that had been building power in northwestern Persia for generations. His followers, the Kizilbash, the redheads named for their distinctive crimson turbans, were not just soldiers. They were true believers, men who thought Ismail was divine or close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. They would walk into fire for him. Many of them did. In 1501, Ismail captured the city of Tabriz. He was still a teenager. He stood in the great mosque of the city and made an announcement that every person present understood was not just religious but political, not just political but civilizational. He declared himself Shah of Persia. And he declared Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion of his new empire. Twelver Shia Islam. The name comes from the belief in 12 imams, 12 rightful leaders descended from the Prophet through Ali, each one the true spiritual guide of the Muslim community. 11 of those imams had been killed or imprisoned by Sunni rulers. The 12th, a child named Muhammad al-Mahdi, had disappeared in 874, not died, disappeared. The Twelver Shia believed he had entered a state of occultation, hidden from the world but still alive, still spiritually present, waiting to return at the end of times to fill the earth with justice as it had been filled with oppression. The hidden imam. Sit with that for a moment. Here is a faith built around a rightful ruler who has been driven into hiding by unjust power, who is absent but not gone, who will return, whose return will mean the final reckoning for all the kings and caliphs who stole what was not theirs, for a Persian civilization that had spent 1,000 years watching its rightful rulers displaced, watching its identity stolen, watching its empire carved up by foreigners. This theology was not abstract. It was autobiography. Ismail did not just convert his kingdom. He transformed Shia Islam into the spiritual backbone of a new Persian identity. To be Persian was now to be Shia. To be Shia was now to be Persian. The two had fused, welded together by centuries of shared grief and a shared story about what that grief meant. The conversion was not gentle. Sunni scholars who refused were expelled or killed. Sunni mosques were rededicated. The call to prayer changed. The religious calendar changed. Persia had been majority Sunni for centuries. Ismail remade it in a generation through a combination of genuine religious conviction and absolute political ruthlessness. He believed what he was doing. That made him more dangerous, not less. And it worked. Not immediately. Not without cost. The Ottoman Empire to the west was Sunni and deeply hostile to this new Shia state on its border. In 1514, at the Battle of Chaldiran, the Ottomans crushed Ismail's forces. He never recovered psychologically. A man who had believed himself perhaps invincible, certainly divinely favored, spent the rest of his life in the shadow of that defeat. He drank too much. He withdrew. He died at 37. But the empire he built did not die with him. His successors, particularly Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629, took what Ismail had planted and grew it into something extraordinary. Abbas moved the capital to Isfahan, deep in the Persian heartland. He built it into one of the most beautiful cities on earth. The great mosque of Isfahan, the bazaars, the vast central square, the bridges over the Zayandeh River. These were not just architecture. They were a statement. Persia is back. Persia is here. Persia is magnificent. Stand in the courtyard of the Shah Mosque in Isfahan even today, and the scale of it stops you cold. The blue tiles catching the light, the minarets reaching up against a sky so wide and clear, it feels like a different atmosphere than anywhere else on earth. The sound of footsteps echoing across stone that has heard 5 centuries of prayer. Abbas built this not just for God. He built it for Persia, as proof of concept, as a declaration that the civilization that had survived Alexander and the Arabs and the Mongols had not just survived. It had arrived at something new, something that was neither purely ancient nor purely Islamic, but a fusion of both. That fusion ran through everything. Persian poetry had always been magnificent. Now it wrapped itself around Shia theology. The great poets wrote about the martyrdom of Husayn with the same imagery they used for earthly love, grief as beauty, longing as spiritual discipline. Persian architecture absorbed Islamic geometry and transformed it, made it more ornate, more human, more alive. Persian scholars became the leading theologians of the Shia world. They did not simply adopt an imported faith, they colonized it intellectually. They made it theirs. And here is where the political calculation becomes something even more interesting. With the Imam hidden, someone had to manage the affairs of the faithful in his absence. Someone had to interpret Islamic law, settle disputes, guide the community. That someone, the Shia scholars argued, was themselves, the clerics, the ulama. The men who had spent their lives studying the tradition, who could read the Arabic texts, who understood the theological lineage that connected them back to Ali and the Prophet. In the absence of the hidden imam, religious authority fell to them. This was a slow revolution, slower than Ismail's military conquest, but in some ways more profound. Over the course of the Safavid period, the Shia clerical class grew into a power structure entirely separate from the state. They controlled religious education. They controlled the interpretation of law. They collected their own religious taxes, the khums, a 20% levy on certain earnings paid directly to the scholars. They had their own income, their own institutions, their own hierarchy, their own claim to legitimacy that did not depend on any king. The Shah needed them. He needed their authority to legitimize his rule, but they did not need him in the same way. They needed the state to protect the faith, but their ultimate authority came not from the Shah, but from God, mediated through the hidden 12th Imam, whose representative on earth they claimed, in various ways, to be. The tension between those two power centers, the king and the cleric, the crown and the turban, would define Iranian politics for the next 5 centuries. It is still defining them now. The air in the great seminaries of Isfahan and later Qom carried the smell of old paper and lamp oil, the particular smell of men who spend their lives in rooms full of books, arguing about texts that are 1,000 years old. Their hands were ink-stained. Their voices were trained for recitation and debate. They were not warriors, but they were building something that would outlast every warrior who came after them. They were building a claim to power that could survive the death of any dynasty, because it was not attached to any dynasty. It was attached to God. By the early 18th century, the Safavid Empire was exhausted. Ottoman pressure from the West had never fully relented. Internal decay had set in. In 1722, an Afghan force marched on Isfahan. The city fell. The last effective Safavid Shah fled. The dynasty that had remade Persia stumbled toward its end, collapsing not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, grinding way that all empires eventually go. The walls of Isfahan still stood. The mosques still gleamed. But the men who had built them were gone. What remained was not a government, not an army, not a dynasty. What remained was a people who had been told for 200 years a story about who they were. They were Shia, they were Persian. They were the heirs of Hussein, the people of the martyred Imam, the community that knew what it meant to suffer at the hands of unjust power and to endure anyway, to keep faith anyway, to keep going anyway, because the hidden Imam would return, and when he did, justice would finally come. That story did not need a Shah to survive. It lived in the seminaries. It lived in the yearly mourning rituals of Muharram, when men and women wept in the streets for Hussein as if he had died that morning, as if Karbala were not 14 centuries gone, but a wound still fresh. It lived in the Friday sermons of scholars who spoke with an authority that no foreign conqueror could grant and no foreign army could take away. By the 18th century, the Safavid dynasty collapsed, torn apart by Ottoman pressure and internal decay. But something endured that no military force could destroy. The fusion of Shia theology with Persian nationalism had hardened into identity itself. In the minds of ordinary Iranians, to be Iranian was to be Shia. To be Shia was to resist, and resistance, they would learn, could be a path to power. The Safavid Empire was gone. But the memory of what Persia had been did not die with it. It settled into the bones of the people, into the rhythm of the mourning rituals, into the quiet authority of the seminary scholars who kept speaking long after the last Shah had fled. For decades after the collapse, Persia fractured. Warlords fought over the ruins. Tribal chieftains carved out territories. The land bled. Then, out of the north, came a man named Aga Muhammad Khan. He was the chieftain of the Qajar tribe, a Turkic people from the northern reaches of Iran. He was also, by every account that survives, ferociously ruthless. When Karam Khanzan died in 1779, the power struggle that followed was brutal and total. Aga Muhammad fought through it all. He crushed the remnants of the Zand dynasty. He destroyed the Afsharid claimants. One by one, every rival fell. By 1796, he had done what no one had managed in decades. He had unified Persia under a single hand, his hand. The Qajar dynasty had begun, and it would last until 1925. But here is the thing about the Qajars that matters most. They inherited a country that the world had already started to leave behind. While Persia had been tearing itself apart in the 18th century, something enormous had been happening in Europe. Steam engines, factories, mass-produced rifles, railroads cutting across continents. A whole new way of organizing power, wealth, and violence. Europe had not just changed, it had transformed into something Persia had never faced before. Something hungry, something mechanical, something that did not negotiate so much as it arrived. To the north sat Russia, expanding south for a century, pressing toward warm water ports, toward trade routes, toward influence. To the south and east sat the British Empire, moving up from India, protecting the approaches to its crown jewel, willing to do whatever it took to keep rivals out. Persia sat between them, not as an equal, as a prize. The early Qajar Shahs were not blind to this. They could smell the danger the way you can smell smoke before you see the fire. But smelling danger and knowing how to survive it are two very different things. And the Qajars, for all their political cunning in domestic affairs, were simply outmatched by what was coming. The wars with Russia came first. In 1813, after a grinding conflict that Persia could not win, the Qajar Shah signed the Treaty of Gulistan. Persia surrendered vast territories in the Caucasus. Gone. Signed away on paper, while Russian officers looked on with the calm patience of men who already know they have won. The shame of it sat in every Persian court, in every bazaar, in every sermon. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not the nation of Cyrus, of Darius, of the great Shahs who had once made the world tremble. Then it happened again. In 1828, another war, another defeat, another treaty. The Treaty of Turkmenchay stripped Persia of even more Caucasian territory. But the territorial loss was almost secondary. The treaty forced Persia to grant Russian citizens special legal rights on Persian soil. They could not be tried in Persian courts. They stood outside Persian law. In their own country, Persians had become second class. The humiliation was not just political. It was personal. It was felt in the gut, like a hand pressed flat against your chest, pushing you back, telling you that you do not belong here, not anymore. The British were no less aggressive. They simply worked differently. Where Russia used armies, Britain used money and contracts and what they called concessions. The word sounds almost polite. It was not polite. A concession meant that a Persian Shah, usually desperate for cash, would sign over the rights to some piece of his country's wealth. A railroad, a telegraph line, a bank, a monopoly on tobacco. The British would operate it, profit from it, and in the process weave themselves so deeply into the Persian economy that removing them would be like trying to pull out your own skeleton. The Qajar Shahs kept signing. They needed the money. Their court was expensive. Their military was weak. Every concession bought them a little more time, a little more stability, a little more breathing room. What it cost them was sovereignty, sold off in pieces, quietly, with ink and signatures and the sound of distant London bankers opening their ledgers. Ordinary Persians watched this happen, and they burned. The clergy burned. The merchants in the bazaars burned. The educated young men who had started to travel to Europe and come back with ideas about constitutions and parliaments and the rights of citizens, they burned most of all, because they could see it clearly now. The problem was not just foreign aggression. The problem was a system of rule that had no check on it, no limit, no mechanism for the people to say, "Enough, this is wrong, you cannot sell us like this." In 1891, a Shah named Nasser al-Din granted a British company a total monopoly on the production, sale, and export of Persian tobacco. Every tobacco farmer in the country, every merchant who traded in it, every man who sat in a coffee house and drew smoke through a water pipe, all of it handed to a foreign company for profit. The response was something Persia had not seen before. The senior clerics issued a religious ruling, a fatwa: do not smoke, not until the concession is cancelled. And across the country, Persians stopped. Pipes went cold. Coffee houses fell silent. Even in the Shah's own palace, the women of the royal harem reportedly refused to smoke. The smell of tobacco, which had drifted through Persian social life for generations, simply vanished. The Shah cancelled the concession within months. It was a small victory, but it cracked something open. It showed that organized popular resistance, backed by clerical authority, could actually work, could force a Shah to back down. That was a lesson nobody forgot. The ideas kept building. Newspapers started printing arguments about constitutionalism. Underground pamphlets circulated in the bazaars. The word mashrute, meaning constitutional, became a rallying cry. What people wanted was not revolution exactly, not yet. What they wanted was a law that stood above the Shah, a parliament. A set of rules that no single man could simply override because he felt like it or because a foreign ambassador had pressed him to. In 1905, the pressure finally broke the surface. Protests erupted in Tehran. Merchants and clerics took sanctuary together in the grounds of a mosque, a traditional form of protest called bast, where Persian law shielded them from arrest. The movement spread. More sanctuaries, more protests, more voices demanding the same thing. And in 1906, the Shah gave in. Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, old and ill, signed the decree that established a constitution and a parliament. The Majlis, they called it. Representatives of the people meeting in a hall in Tehran, making laws. It was extraordinary. In a country that had been ruled by absolute monarchs for centuries, ordinary Persians had forced their king to accept limits on his own power. People wept in the streets of Tehran, not from grief this time, from something they had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. But hope is not a strategy, and the men celebrating in Tehran that autumn were about to discover something cold and hard about the world they actually lived in. The constitution was written on paper. Empires moved on the ground. And the two empires that had been squeezing Persia for a century had not suddenly decided to leave it alone just because its people had written a document. In 1907, barely a year after the constitution was signed, Britain and Russia sat down together in St. Petersburg and divided Persia between them. Not formally, not with a flag-planting ceremony, with a quiet agreement. Russia would control the northern zone. Britain would control the southern zone. There was a small, neutral zone in the middle that both powers agreed to leave alone for now. Nobody asked the Persians. The constitutional revolution had happened. The parliament was meeting. The reformers were writing laws. And two foreign powers were carving the country up, like men cutting a map with a pen, deciding which roads and which oil fields and which ports belonged to which empire's sphere of influence. The oil had just been found in the southwest in 1908. British Petroleum, in its earliest form, was already drilling. The stakes had just gotten higher. The parliament fought on. Clerics who had backed the constitution began to split. Some said a constitution was compatible with Islamic law. Others said it was a foreign corruption, a Western disease dressed up as progress. The debate was not just political, it was theological. It went to the heart of everything the Safavids had built into Persian identity. The question of who holds legitimate authority when the hidden imam is absent. A parliament? A shah? A senior cleric? The question had no clean answer, and the disagreement would fester for decades. What remained, as the first decade of the 20th century closed, was a country that had tasted the idea of self-determination and then watched foreign powers ignore it completely. A country where the old certainties of Safavid religious authority had given way to something more fractured and more contested. A country sitting on enormous oil wealth that it did not control. A country whose parliament was real but whose sovereignty was hollow. That gap between what Persia believed it deserved to be and what the world was actually allowing it to be was becoming unbearable. Something had to give. Someone had to come along and say, "Enough. I will drag this country into the modern world by force if I have to. I will build an army. I will expel the foreign influence. I will make Persia strong again, even if it costs everything and everyone who stands in the way." By 1906, Persians had risen up and forced their king to accept a constitution. It felt like victory. But the constitution was written on paper, while empires moved on the ground. The British were already moving through the south. The Russians were pressing from the north. And in the chaos of these great power games, a ruthless military officer named Reza Khan was quietly gathering power. He had a vision. It would shake Persia to its core. Reza Khan burst onto the Persian political scene like a comet. He was not interested in philosophy or tradition or the slow dance of diplomatic negotiation. He wanted one thing: to make Persia modern, to make it strong, to make it matter in a world where only the strong survived. And for nearly 50 years, through him and then through his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, that vision shaped everything: roads, schools, hospitals, factories. Women unveiled and educated for the first time in centuries. Oil wells pumping wealth into the national treasury. It was a miracle. Or it looked like one. Picture him as a young man. 14 years old, joining the Persian Cossack Brigade with nothing but ambition and a body built for hard work. The Cossack Brigade was the closest thing Persia had to a real fighting force, and even it was commanded by Russian officers, a foreign army on Persian soil protecting a Persian king. That humiliation sat in Reza Khan like a coal, burning slow and steady for decades. He watched, he learned, he rose. By 1921, he was a brigadier general, and he had stopped waiting for permission. On a cold February morning in 1921, he moved. He led his Cossack forces on Tehran, not with a declaration, not with a manifesto, with boots on the ground and rifles in hand. The Qajar government, already hollowed out by years of foreign interference and internal collapse, offered almost no resistance. Within days, Reza Khan was Minister of War. Within a few years, he was Prime Minister. And in 1925, the last Qajar Shah, Ahmad Shah, was formally deposed. The parliament voted. Reza Khan became Reza Shah Pahlavi. A new dynasty was born. Think about what that name meant, Pahlavi. He chose it deliberately. It was the name of the ancient Persian language, the tongue of the pre-Islamic empire. He was not just seizing power. He was reaching back across more than 1,000 years and saying, "We are that people. We are heirs to Cyrus and Darius, not subjects of foreign empires, not a buffer zone between Britain and Russia, Persia itself." And the world was going to have to reckon with that. The modernization began immediately, and it came fast. The smell of fresh concrete was everywhere in Tehran. New government buildings rose from what had been muddy streets. Schools opened, and not just for boys. Secular education, modeled on European systems, began pulling children away from the traditional religious curriculum. Reza Shah looked at Turkey, where Ataturk had done something similar, and he took notes. He wanted an Iran that looked and functioned like a European nation-state. He wanted it now. He was not a patient man. The dress laws came next. In 1928, Western-style clothing became mandatory for men in official settings. Turbans were banned for most men who were not clerics. In 1936, Reza Shah went further. He banned the veil for women completely. State police were ordered to physically remove head coverings from women who appeared in public wearing them. Imagine that moment. A woman who had worn the veil her entire life, whose mother and grandmother had worn it, stepping into the street and having a soldier pull it from her head. Some women refused to leave their homes for months. They chose confinement over what they experienced as public exposure, as violation. Reza Shah called this liberation. Many of those women called it something else entirely. But here's the thing. For other women, it genuinely was liberation. Girls who had never sat in a classroom now could. Women who had been legally invisible began entering universities and professions. Tehran University opened in 1934, and women walked through those gates. That was real. That mattered. The same act, the same policy, the same man, produced both genuine freedom and genuine trauma, depending on where you stood. That contradiction was not a flaw in the Pahlavi project. It was the project. The economy moved too. Reza Shah built roads connecting cities that had previously been separated by weeks of difficult travel. He constructed a trans-Iranian railway that crossed some of the most brutal terrain on Earth, mountain ranges and desert flats connecting the Caspian coast in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It was an engineering achievement that stunned foreign observers. He built it with Iranian labor, Iranian planning, and Iranian money, without taking foreign loans, because foreign loans meant foreign strings. He had seen what those strings looked like. He refused them. And then there was the oil. The oil had been there all along, of course. The British had been extracting it since 1908 under the terms of the Darcy Concession, a deal signed by a desperate Qajar government that gave Britain almost everything and left Persia almost nothing. Reza Shah renegotiated. He pushed back. He cancelled the original concession in 1932 and forced a new agreement in 1933. He did not get everything he wanted. Britain was still too powerful for that. But he got more. The royalty payments increased. The concession area shrank. It was not justice, but it was a step. The oil revenues began to flow more substantially into the Iranian treasury, and Reza Shah poured them into his vision. Factories, steelworks, textile mills. A country that had been almost entirely agricultural and pastoral began to industrialize. Tehran grew. It grew fast. New neighborhoods, new boulevards, new government ministries with European facades. If you had left Tehran in 1920 and returned in 1940, you would not have recognized it. The city had been remade by sheer will. But will, when it belongs to one man, is also something else. It is control. And Reza Shah's control grew tighter with every passing year. Tribal leaders who had held autonomous power in their regions for centuries were broken, their weapons confiscated, their influence destroyed. Religious scholars who had once shaped public life found themselves pushed to the margins. Newspapers that questioned the government were shut down. Politicians who pushed back too hard disappeared, not metaphorically. They disappeared. There was a sound that spread through Tehran in those years, low and constant. That was not the sound of construction. It was the sound of silence, where argument used to be. The bazaars still hummed. The tea houses still filled. But certain conversations stopped happening in public. People learned to watch what they said and who was listening when they said it. Reza Shah had no formal secret police apparatus to rival what would come later. But he did not need one. The fear was sufficient. Then came 1941, and the Second World War reached Iran. Britain and the Soviet Union, now allies against Hitler, looked at Iran's rail network, the very railway Reza Shah had built with such pride, and they needed it. They needed it to move supplies from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet front. They demanded Iran expel German nationals living in the country. Reza Shah hesitated. He had cultivated German ties partly as a counterweight to British and Russian influence, a third power to balance against the two that had always squeezed Iran between them. That hesitation was enough. In August 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran from multiple directions. The Iranian army, for all Reza Shah's investment in it, collapsed in days. He was forced to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed on the throne. He was 21 years old. Think about that. 21, handed a country that foreign armies were occupying, by a father who had just been stripped of everything he built. Reza Shah was taken into exile by the British. He died in South Africa in 1944, in a hotel room far from the country he had transformed. He never went home. Mohammad Reza Shah started from a position of profound weakness, and he knew it. The early years of his reign were chaotic. Political parties competed openly. The press was loud and fractious. The parliament was genuinely powerful. And then came Mohammad Mossadegh, and the crisis that would define the younger Shah's reign forever. Mossadegh was prime minister by 1951, and he did what many Iranians had dreamed of for decades. He nationalized the oil industry. He looked at the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the successor to that original British concession, and he said, "This oil belongs to Iran. The company, the refineries, the revenues, ours." The British were furious. They organized an international boycott of Iranian oil. The Iranian economy began to buckle under the pressure. And in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence organized a coup. They called it Operation Ajax. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah, who had briefly fled the country in panic, was returned to his throne by foreign hands. That fact, those foreign hands, would never leave Iranian memory. The Shah knew it too. He sat on a throne that foreign powers had restored for him, and the weight of that knowledge was in his face every time he appeared in public. He moved carefully at first, then less carefully, then not at all. The oil revenues grew dramatically through the 1950s and 60s, and the Shah used them to accelerate modernization beyond anything his father had attempted. He called it the White Revolution, launched in 1963. Land reform, literacy programs, women's suffrage, the expansion of industry, more roads, more schools, more hospitals. On paper, it was transformative. In practice, it disrupted the lives of millions of Iranians whose entire economic and social world was organized around patterns the White Revolution was dismantling. The religious establishment watched all of this with growing alarm. A cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini began speaking publicly against the Shah. He was arrested in 1963 after giving a speech that directly attacked the regime. Riots broke out. The Shah's security forces put them down with force. Khomeini was eventually exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, then to France. But exile did not silence him. His voice traveled back into Iran on cassette tapes, passed hand to hand through the bazaars and the mosques. The regime could not stop a tape. And then there was Savak, the Shah's secret police, established in 1957 with help from the CIA and Israel's Mossad. Savak was everywhere. It monitored universities, mosques, government ministries, military barracks, and foreign embassies. It arrested people. It tortured people. The methods were not subtle. Electric shocks, sleep deprivation, beatings that left no visible marks, and some that left every visible mark. Amnesty International documented the abuses. Foreign journalists reported them. The Shah dismissed the criticism. He said his enemies exaggerated. He said Iran was making progress, and progress required stability, and stability required discipline. People who heard him say this in public went home and locked their doors, not out of comfort, out of dread. The Baha'i community felt this dread in concentrated form. Iran's Baha'i population, a religious minority that had faced persecution since the faith emerged in the 19th century, found themselves targeted repeatedly. Savak monitored them closely. They were excluded from government positions. Their holy sites were desecrated. The regime found them useful as a target, a way to demonstrate religious loyalty to conservative constituencies while pursuing secular modernization in every other direction. The contradiction was not lost on anyone watching. By the 1970s, the Shah was at his peak and also at his most isolated. The oil price shock of 1973 sent revenues soaring. Iran's GDP grew at extraordinary rates. The Shah ordered weapons from the United States in quantities that staggered even American defense contractors. He spoke of making Iran the dominant military power in the region. He spoke of a great civilization, a phrase he used publicly and repeatedly. He threw a spectacular party at Persepolis in 1971 to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. World leaders attended. The champagne flowed. The cost was extraordinary. Ordinary Iranians, many of whom were still poor, watched it on television and felt something shift inside them. It was not admiration. It was the particular cold feeling of being told your suffering is a footnote to someone else's glory. The universities were full of young Iranians who had been educated by the very modernization program the Shah championed, and they were reading Marx and Fanon and Shariati, an Iranian intellectual who was weaving Islamic thought together with revolutionary politics in ways that gave the religious establishment's anger an intellectual framework. These students did not want to go back to the past. They wanted justice in the present. They had been given education and then told to be grateful and silent. They were not grateful. They were not silent. In the bazaars, merchants who had thrived under the old economic patterns found their businesses undercut by the Shah's rapid industrialization and his preference for large Western corporations over traditional Iranian commerce. The clerics were losing influence and income and authority. The intellectuals were being watched and arrested. The poor in the new urban slums that had grown up around Tehran were discovering that the promised prosperity had not reached them. The Shah's modernization had created a country that was richer in aggregate and more unequal in reality. By the 1970s, Iran seemed to be ascending. New cities rose from deserts. Oil revenues poured in. The Shah commanded an army, a secret police, and the respect of the Western world. Yet in the bazaars and the mosques and the universities, something else was stirring, a rage that could not be measured in GDP or military hardware. The very modernization that was supposed to strengthen Iran was tearing it apart, and the man who ruled this glittering, fractured nation was about to face the storm he never saw coming. Even as the Shah's monuments rose across Iran's landscape, opposition was forming in the invisible spaces. In university dormitories where 4 students shared a single room, in theological seminaries where young clerics bent over texts by lamplight, in underground printing presses hidden behind false walls in Tehran's older neighborhoods. These were not peasants. These were not the desperately poor scraping at the edges of the new economy. These were the educated children of Iran, the very people who should have felt grateful for the modernization their fathers could never have dreamed of. But education, it turned out, was a dangerous gift. Because once you learn to read, you begin to question. And once you question, you cannot stop. The universities the Shah built, filled with young Iranians who had grown up hearing about 1953, not as a dry political event, as a wound, as a story passed between older brothers and fathers and uncles in lowered voices. In that year, a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh had tried to nationalize Iran's oil, to take back the resource that sat beneath Iranian soil and had been flowing into British pockets for decades. The British and the Americans had organized a coup. They brought the Shah back to power on a wave of foreign money and CIA planning. Mossadegh was arrested. Iranian sovereignty was traded for Western strategic interest, and the Shah who returned from that coup was not a free king. He was, in the eyes of millions of his own people, a man who owed his throne to foreigners. That story never left. It lodged in the national memory like a splinter. By the 1960s, Iranian students arriving at universities in Tehran and abroad were reading Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist who had written about the psychological damage of colonialism with a fury that felt personal. They were reading Karl Marx. They were reading about imperialism, about how powerful nations used weaker ones as instruments, and they looked at Iran, and they looked at 1953, and the pieces fit together in a way that felt like revelation. The smell of cheap ink on mimeographed pamphlets filled the dormitory corridors. Students passed them hand to hand, underlining sentences, arguing in whispers until 2 in the morning. They were not reading these books in secret because the ideas were new. They were reading them in secret because the Shah's secret police, Sabakeh, was watching. Sabakeh had been built with American and Israeli assistance in the late 1950s. It had informants in universities, in mosques, in workplaces. A careless conversation could end a career. A pamphlet found in the wrong pocket could mean a cell in Evin prison. And in that prison, men came out changed in ways they did not talk about openly. Fear was the Shah's instrument. But fear has a cost. When you press a generation of educated young people into silence, you do not extinguish their anger. You concentrate it. You give it nowhere to go but inward, where it hardens into something far more dangerous than protest. It becomes conviction. Into this charged atmosphere walked the ideas of Ali Shariati. He was an Iranian intellectual who had studied in Paris and returned carrying something extraordinary. He had taken the language of Islamic faith, the stories and symbols that every Iranian had absorbed since childhood, and he had fused them with the anti-colonial politics of Fanon and the revolutionary urgency of Marxist thought. He spoke about the oppressed and the oppressors. He spoke about the betrayal of authentic Iranian identity by both Western capitalism and by a clerical establishment he thought had grown comfortable and corrupt. He gave students a framework where being a Muslim and being a revolutionary were not contradictions. They were the same thing. Shariati's lectures drew crowds that the government watched with deep unease. Young Iranians who had felt torn between their faith and their politics suddenly felt whole. They did not have to choose between the mosque and the revolution. Shariati told them the mosque was the revolution. His words moved through Iran's youth like electricity through water. And the Shah's modernization program, which had put all these young people in the same universities at the same time with the same grievances, had built the perfect vessel to carry that current. But the intellectual opposition was not the only force gathering. In the seminaries of Qom, Iran's great center of Shia Islamic scholarship, a different kind of anger was taking shape. The clerics had watched the Shah's white revolution with something colder than political disagreement. For them, it was an assault on the foundations of Iranian life. Land reform had stripped the religious endowments of property. The expansion of women's rights, however limited, challenged the social order they considered sacred. The literacy corps and the modernization of law moved authority away from religious scholars and toward a secular state apparatus that answered to the Shah and, through him, to the West. For most of the senior clerics, the response was caution, quietism. The tradition in Shia Islam of keeping the clergy out of direct political governance ran deep. Grand ayatollahs counseled patience and prayer and separation from the dirty business of politics. One man did not counsel patience. Ruhollah Khomeini was a senior cleric in Qom with a face carved from certainty and eyes that did not soften when he spoke. He had been watching the Shah's reforms with open fury for years. In 1963, when the Shah held a referendum on the White Revolution, Khomeini denounced it publicly and loudly. He called the Shah's program an attack on Islam. He called the Shah an agent of foreign powers. He said these things out loud, in public, at a time when saying them could get you killed. The government arrested him. There were protests in the streets. The Shah's security forces opened fire. Dozens died, possibly hundreds. The exact number was never confirmed, because the Shah's government did not confirm such things. Khomeini did not go quiet. He kept speaking. In 1964, after his release, he denounced a new law giving American military personnel and their families immunity from Iranian courts. He called it a capitulation to American power. He said the Shah had sold Iranian sovereignty for a loan. He said it plainly, without diplomatic softening, in a voice that carried the full weight of religious authority behind every word. The Shah exiled him. First to Turkey, then to the Shia holy city of Najaf in Iraq, where Khomeini would spend the next 14 years. But exile did not silence him. His sermons were recorded on small cassette tapes. Those tapes were copied and smuggled into Iran inside luggage, inside books, tucked into the lining of bags. They moved through the mosque networks, through the bazaar networks, through the informal channels of a society that had learned to carry information in hidden ways because the official channels were controlled and watched. You could not arrest a cassette tape. Khomeini's voice, recorded in Najaf, played in living rooms and back rooms across Iran. His message was consistent and uncompromising. The Shah was illegitimate. His rule was un-Islamic. The West was using him to drain Iran of its resources and its identity. And the solution was not reform. The solution was the removal of the Shah and the establishment of a government rooted in Islamic law, governed by Islamic scholars. This was a revolutionary idea within Shia Islam itself. The tradition said clerics should advise, not rule. Khomeini was arguing for something new, a concept he called belayat, faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. He was saying that in the absence of the hidden imam, the supreme religious scholar should hold supreme political authority. It was a theological argument. It was also a blueprint for a completely different kind of state. Many senior clerics disagreed with him, but the people who were passing those cassette tapes from hand to hand in the dark were not debating theology. They were hearing a man who spoke their anger back to them without flinching. Meanwhile, on the other side of the opposition, younger and more impatient forces were reaching for something sharper than lectures and pamphlets. The Mujahedin-e-Khalq, known as the MEK, formed in the mid-1960s. They were young, educated, and furious. Their ideology blended Islam with revolutionary Marxism, in a way that put them in a strange middle ground, too religious for the secular left, too Marxist for the traditional clergy. But what defined them most clearly was not their theology. It was their willingness to use violence. They believed that the Shah's regime could not be argued out of power. It had to be fought out of power. They trained in secret. They studied guerrilla tactics. They carried out bombings and targeted killings of Iranian officials and American military advisors stationed in Iran. Savak hunted them with brutal efficiency. Their founders were captured, tortured, and executed. New members took their places. The cycle of repression and recruitment fed itself. There was also the Fedayeen, the organization of Iranian People's Fedayeen guerrillas, a secular Marxist group that rejected religious framing entirely. They too chose armed struggle. They attacked military and police targets. They were hunted too. They lost members to Savak's interrogation rooms and to firing squads. What united these groups, despite their profound differences, was a shared diagnosis. Iran was not free. Its government served foreign interests. The Shah was the instrument of that unfreedom. And the suffering of ordinary Iranians, the slum dwellers of South Tehran, the workers whose wages did not keep pace with the oil boom, the students who could not speak their minds without fear, was the price being paid for a modernization that benefited the few. The Shah was not blind to any of this. He knew opposition existed. That is precisely why Savak existed. But he misread what he was seeing. He saw students reading Marx and thought manageable. He saw clerics in Qom and thought irrelevant. He saw guerrilla attacks and thought containable. He did not see the way these separate currents were beginning to flow toward each other. He did not see that the cassette tapes carrying Khomeini's voice were being listened to in the same neighborhoods where Shariati's pamphlets were being read. He did not see that the bazaar merchant who resented Western corporations and the seminary student who resented secular law and the university student who resented autocracy were all, separately, arriving at the same conclusion. The Shah had to go. The irony was suffocating. The modernization program, the universities, the expanded literacy, the new middle class, these were supposed to be the foundations of a stable, prosperous, Western-aligned Iran. Instead, they had produced a generation educated enough to articulate its own oppression and angry enough to act on that articulation. The Shah had lit a fire and handed it to people who had every reason to burn the house down. In 1973, oil prices quadrupled after the Arab oil embargo. Iran was not part of the embargo, and the Shah used the moment to demand higher prices from Western oil companies. Revenues flooded in. He used them to accelerate modernization, to buy weapons, to fund grand projects. Tehran glittered. Inflation rose. The gap between the gleaming new Iran and the lived reality of most Iranians stretched wider. In the bazaars, the old merchant class felt the squeeze of rapid economic change. In the mosques, the clergy felt the squeeze of a state that no longer needed their authority to legitimate itself. In the universities, students felt the squeeze of a system that educated them and then offered them a future inside a cage. 3 separate pressures, 3 separate sources of rage, and no channel through which any of it could safely flow. By 1977, something was changing in the air. The new American president, Jimmy Carter, had made human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy. The Shah, needing American support, felt a subtle but real pressure to loosen his grip slightly. Political prisoners were released, some censorship eased. The opposition, which had been pressing against a locked door for 15 years, suddenly felt the door move. That movement was everything. When a population has been held down by fear, and then the fear relaxes even slightly, it does not relax carefully. It does not test the new limits politely. It rushes into the space that is opened, all the accumulated anger and grief and hope pouring through the gap at once. The Shah had miscalculated. He thought a small opening would release pressure. It released something else entirely. Poets began publishing work that had been hidden in drawers for years. Writers organized. Intellectuals who had been silent in public began speaking. The underground networks, the mosque connections, the university networks, the bazaar networks, all of them felt the shift and began to move. The first cracks in the fear were not dramatic. They were quiet. A meeting here, a pamphlet there, a reading at a private home that drew more people than anyone expected. Voices, carefully, beginning to find each other across the divides of ideology and faith and class. By 1977, Iran was a nation being pulled in three irreconcilable directions simultaneously. The Shah pushed Western modernization and centralized autocracy. The religious scholars demanded a return to Islamic values and clerical authority. The young intellectuals dreamed of a socialist, anti-imperialist future. These forces could coexist in peace only so long as the Shah maintained control through fear. But fear, once broken, is never restored. And in 1977, the first cracks in that fear began to show. The three ideologies had been circling each other for years. Now they collided. The Shah's modernized state, the cleric's vision of Islamic governance, the intellectual's dream of socialist liberation. Three futures, one country. And in January of 1978, a single newspaper article lit the fuse that none of them could put out. The article appeared in the government-controlled press on the 7th of January. It attacked Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini by name. It called him a foreign agent. It mocked his religious credentials. It was the kind of attack that the Shah's information ministers had used before, a calculated smear designed to discredit a troublesome cleric. But this time, the calculation was wrong, badly wrong. In the holy city of Qom, the seminaries emptied into the streets. Religious students, young men in turbans and robes, poured out of their schools and began to march. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They were scholars or students of scholarship, men who had spent their days bent over ancient texts. But they walked into the streets of Qom with something more dangerous than weapons. They walked out with grief and with fury and with the absolute conviction that they were right. The Shah's security forces met them. The confrontation turned violent. People died. And that was the moment, that exact moment in January of 1978, when the cascade began. Because in Shia Islam, death is not simply an ending, it is a summons. The tradition of mourning runs deep in Shia culture, deeper than politics, deeper than ideology. 40 days after a death, you gather and remember, you weep, you pray, you honor the fallen. The Shah's forces had just created martyrs. And 40 days later, on the 20th of February, those martyrs were mourned. The mourning ceremonies drew crowds. The crowds became protests. The protests became clashes. More people died, and 40 days after that, they were mourned too. The Shah had not suppressed a movement. He had created a calendar. Every 40 days, the cycle renewed itself. Every act of repression produced new funerals. Every funeral produced new rage. Every act of rage produced new repression. The government was pouring water onto a grease fire. They could not stop it because the mechanism of Shia mourning was older than the Pahlavi dynasty, older than the modern state, older than anything the Shah's Western-educated advisors had models for. You cannot arrest a ritual. You cannot shoot a tradition. Through the spring and summer of 1978, the protests spread outward from Qom to Tehran, to Isfahan, to Tabriz, to Shiraz. City after city, the pattern repeated. Demonstrations, crackdowns, deaths, funerals, larger demonstrations. The air in Tehran that summer smelled of tear gas and burning tires, sharp and acrid, catching in the throat like a warning you could not ignore. And from a small house in the Paris suburb of Neauphle-le-Château, an old man in a black turban watched it all. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been in exile since 1964. The Shah had expelled him for speaking too loudly, for challenging too directly, for refusing to be quiet when quiet was required. Khomeini had spent years in Iraq, in the holy city of Najaf, continuing to teach, continuing to write, continuing to build a network of followers who carried his ideas back into Iran in cassette tapes smuggled under clothing and passed from hand to hand in bazaars and mosques. Now he was in France, and France had something Iraq did not: international telephone lines, international journalists, the world's press corps. Khomeini sat in that small house and gave interview after interview. Journalists from every major news organization in the world made the journey to Naoufle-le-Château. They found a 76-year-old man with a white beard and eyes that gave away nothing. He spoke carefully. He spoke in the language that each audience needed to hear. To the leftists, he spoke of liberation from imperialism. To the religious, he spoke of Islamic justice. To the liberals, he spoke of freedom and the end of tyranny. He was all things to all people, and the people of Iran, desperate for a leader, reached toward him across the distance. He became the symbol, not because he was the only voice of opposition, but because he was the most uncompromising one. The Shah had imprisoned liberals and tortured communists and silenced reformers. He had never been able to silence Khomeini, and now Khomeini's voice was coming back into Iran on every frequency at once. The young intellectuals in Tehran's universities heard that voice and heard what they wanted to hear: liberation, anti-imperialism, the end of American influence, the overthrow of a king who had been put back on his throne by a CIA coup in 1953. These were their causes too. They printed pamphlets with Khomeini's face on them. They marched under his image. They believed, genuinely believed, that the old cleric wanted the same future they wanted. They were not lying to themselves. They were simply hearing different words from the same mouth. By the autumn of 1978, the movement had grown beyond anything that could be called a protest. This was something else. The bazaar merchants closed their shops in solidarity. Teachers stopped teaching. Civil servants stopped working. The machinery of the modern Iranian state, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that the Shah had built over 37 years, began to grind to a halt. And then the oil workers walked out. That was the killing blow. Iran's economy ran on oil. The Shah's military ran on oil revenue. The entire infrastructure of the Pahlavi state depended on those wells pumping, those refineries running, those tankers loading in the Persian Gulf. When the oil workers put down their tools in October of 1978, they did not just damage the economy. They cut the arteries. The Shah stood in his palace and looked at reports that must have felt like dispatches from a collapsing world. His generals told him the army could restore order. His advisors told him to negotiate. His American allies, the Americans who had supported him for decades, sent him mixed signals. Jimmy Carter had made human rights the foundation of his foreign policy, and the images coming out of Iran, of crowds shot in the streets, of bodies in the gutters of holy cities, made American support increasingly difficult to sustain publicly. The Shah was a man who had ruled for 37 years. He had survived a coup attempt, an assassination attempt, and decades of opposition. But he had survived all of those things because fear held. Now fear was gone, and without fear, he had nothing. On the 8th of September 1978, the government declared martial law in Tehran. A massive crowd gathered in Jaila Square, not knowing the declaration had been made or not caring. The soldiers fired. Dozens died, perhaps hundreds. The exact number was disputed then and has been disputed since, but the deaths themselves were not in doubt. That day became known as Black Friday, and Black Friday did not break the movement, it fed it. There is a moment in every revolution when the point of no return is crossed. When enough blood has been spilled, that reconciliation becomes impossible. When the people in the streets have seen enough that they cannot go home and pretend. Black Friday was that moment for Iran. After September 8th, there was no negotiating. There was only victory or defeat. The Shah tried everything. He replaced his prime minister. Then he replaced that prime minister. He offered concessions he would have considered unthinkable a year before. He went on television and spoke directly to the Iranian people, his voice carrying something that sounded almost like an apology. He said he had heard their message. He said he would change. He said the revolution, and he used that word himself. The revolution had triumphed. The people in the streets heard him. Then they went back to the streets, because it was too late. You cannot offer compromise when the other side no longer wants compromise. They wanted him gone, not reformed. Gone. In December of 1978, the month of Muharram arrived. Muharram is the month of Ashura, the holiest period of mourning in the Shia calendar, the commemoration of the death of Imam Hussein at Karbala in the 7th century. The streets of Tehran filled with black. The sound of lamentation rose from every neighborhood, a low, rhythmic keening that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Millions of people poured into the streets of Tehran on the 9th and 10th of December. Some estimates placed the crowd at 2 million, some said more. 2 million people marching through one city. Think about that for a moment. This was not a protest anymore. This was a nation speaking in one voice. The Shah's army, 100,000 strong, trained by American advisors, equipped with American weapons, stood and watched. Because what do you do with 100,000 soldiers when 2 million people are walking past you? You cannot shoot 2 million people. The math does not work. The will does not hold. Individual soldiers began to defect, not in large dramatic groups at first, one by one. A young conscript who had a cousin in the crowd, a sergeant who had a mother in Isfahan who had been marching for months. The Shah's army was not a foreign occupying force. It was made of Iranian men. And Iranian men were watching their country transform around them and making choices about which side of history they wanted to stand on. The Shah left Iran on the 16th of January 1979. He said it was a vacation. He said he was tired and needed rest. He carried a small box of Iranian soil with him as he walked to the plane. He was 63 years old and he was sick, though the full extent of his illness, lymphoma, was not publicly known. He walked across the tarmac at Mehrabad Airport and he did not look back. Or if he did, no cameras caught it. The crowds that gathered to watch him go were weeping, not in grief, in joy. The last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shahanshah, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, the man who had inherited the peacock throne and dreamed of restoring the glory of Cyrus the Great, boarded an airplane and flew out of the country his family had ruled for 37 years. He would never return. He died in exile in Egypt on the 27th of July 1980 without ever seeing Iran again. But his departure was only half the story, because 2 weeks later, the other half landed at Mehrabad Airport. On the 1st of February 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini stepped off an Air France jet and onto Iranian soil for the first time in 15 years. The crowd waiting for him was beyond counting. Millions lined the route from the airport. People had climbed onto rooftops, onto lampposts, onto anything that offered height and a view. The noise was extraordinary, a roar that rolled through the city in waves, cresting and falling and cresting again. Women pressed forward through the crowd with their children held above their heads, trying to get close, trying to touch something, trying to be present in a moment they could feel was historic. Khomeini sat in the car moving through that ocean of humanity, and his face showed nothing. No tears. No smile. A journalist on the plane had asked him what he felt, returning to Iran after 15 years. Khomeini had looked at the journalist and said nothing. His face was a closed door, but the people in the streets were not closed. They were wide open. Every emotion that had been suppressed for 15 years, every fear that had been swallowed, every grief that had been hidden, every hope that had been whispered in private, all of it came flooding out at once. The air smelled of rosewater, which people had sprinkled in the streets, and of something else beneath it, something human and warm, the smell of a crowd so large it generates its own heat. In the days that followed, the last structures of the Pahlavi state began to collapse. The prime minister that the Shah had appointed, Shapur Bakhtiar, a liberal opposition figure who had agreed to serve in a desperate attempt to manage the transition, found himself governing a country that had already moved past him. Khomeini appointed his own prime minister. Iran briefly had two governments. It did not stay that way for long. The military was the last question. Would the generals hold? Would they attempt a coup, as they had in 1953, and restore order by force? Some of them wanted to, but the army was already fracturing from within. Homafars, the Air Force technicians, had already declared their support for Khomeini. Ordinary soldiers were defecting in numbers that made coordinated action impossible. On the 10th and 11th of February, the fighting that had been building for days in Tehran reached its peak. Armed revolutionary groups, a mix of leftist guerrillas, Islamic militants, and ordinary citizens who had picked up weapons, clashed with the last loyalist military units. The streets of Tehran sounded like a war, which is what it was: the crack of rifles, the thud of heavier weapons, glass breaking, people running, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the cold February air. And then, unit by unit, the loyalists stopped fighting. On the 11th of February 1979, the Supreme Military Council announced that the armed forces would maintain neutrality. It was the most important sentence spoken in Iran that year. Neutrality meant the revolution had won. Neutrality meant the old state was finished. Neutrality meant everything that came next. The last units of the Shah's Imperial Guard laid down their weapons. In the streets, strangers grabbed each other and wept. Men who had never met embraced with the desperation of people who had survived something unsurvivable. Women danced in public, uncovered, weeping and laughing at the same time. Car horns sounded across the city in a continuous, joyful, deafening chorus. Children who did not fully understand what had happened ran through the streets because the adults around them were running and the energy was irresistible. They had done it. A nation of 40 million people had faced down a king, his army, his secret police, and the full weight of American backing. They had faced bullets and tear gas and torture and exile, and they had not stopped. They had kept coming, wave after wave, 40 days after 40 days, until the machine broke. Not because the revolutionaries were stronger than the Shah's forces, but because there were more of them, because they kept going, because they refused to be afraid anymore. The intellectuals in the crowd believed they had won a socialist revolution. The religious students believed they had won an Islamic one. The liberals believed they had won a democratic one. The merchants in the bazaar believed they had won freedom from the Shah's economic interference. The young people who had been born under the Pahlavi state and had never known anything else believed they had won a future they could choose for themselves. They were all in the same streets, in the same embrace, in the same tears. And for one extraordinary, fragile, unrepeatable moment, they were all right. But a revolution united only by what it opposes is not a revolution with a shared destination. It is a crowd moving away from something, not towards something. And crowds moving away from something, once the thing they fled is gone, will look around and realize for the first time that the people beside them are strangers. The Shah was gone. Khomeini had returned. The monarchy that had stretched back, in one form or another, across 2,500 years of Persian and Iranian history, had ended in 13 months of protests and strikes and grief and courage. What came next was not written yet. The intellectuals had their pamphlets. The clerics had their mosques and their networks and their old man with the unreadable eyes. The liberals had their hopes. The leftists had their theories. Everyone had a version of the country they had just bled to create. Only one of them would get to build it. On February the 11th, 1979, the last units of the Shah's Imperial Guard laid down their weapons. The revolution had won. In the streets, strangers embraced like lovers. People wept. They had toppled a king, overthrown a 2,500-year dynasty of monarchy, rejected the Western world order that had propped it up, and reclaimed their nation with their bare hands and their unbreakable refusal to stop. But as the celebrations echoed through Tehran's streets, no one was asking the question that should have been asked. A revolution united only by what it was against is not united by what it is for. And in the coming weeks, that distinction would matter more than anyone could have imagined. The celebrations were still echoing through Tehran's streets when the knives came out. Not real knives, not yet. But Khomeini had returned to Iran on February the 1st, 1979, 10 days before the revolution formally won. He had landed at Mehrabad airport to a crowd of millions. And from that first moment, he moved with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years in exile thinking about exactly this. He did not celebrate. He did not weep. He looked out at the crowd, the way a general surveys a battlefield after the fighting is done, already calculating what comes next. What came next was the systematic dismantling of everyone who was not him. The three factions that had broken the Shah's power were the clerics, the secular liberals, and the Marxist left. Each had brought something essential to the revolution. The liberals had the organizational networks, the lawyers, the doctors, the educated middle class who knew how to build institutions. The left had the guerrillas, the Fedayeen, and the Mojahedin-e-Khalq, the young men and women who'd actually taken bullets in the streets. The clerics had the mosques, the theological schools, the ancient trust of the rural poor, and Khomeini himself. In the moment of shared triumph, all three groups believed they had an equal claim on what came next. Only one of them was right about that. Khomeini moved fast. Within weeks of the Shah's fall, he established the Revolutionary Council, packed with loyalists. He created the Revolutionary Guards, a parallel military force that answered directly to him, not to any elected body. He established revolutionary courts that operated outside the existing legal system. And he put forward his concept of velayat, faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. This was the theological framework he had developed in exile, the idea that in the absence of the hidden imam, a senior Islamic scholar must govern society in its entirety, not advise, not guide, govern. The liberals heard this and told themselves it was theoretical. The leftists heard it and told themselves they could work around it. They were both catastrophically wrong. Mehdi Bazargan was appointed the first prime minister of the new Iran. He was a moderate, a nationalist, a man who believed deeply in both Islam and democratic governance. He believed he was there to build a constitutional republic with Islamic values. He lasted less than a year. Every decision he tried to make was undercut by the Revolutionary Council. Every institution he tried to build was shadowed by a parallel clerical structure. He was a figurehead in a frame where someone else had already painted the picture. When he finally resigned in November of 1979, he said he felt like a knife without a blade. The handle was there, the form was there, but it cut nothing. The air in Tehran that autumn smelled of burned paper. Intellectuals were clearing their offices. Professors who had taught at universities for decades were dismissed under new loyalty requirements. Libraries were audited. Books were pulled from shelves and in some cases burned outright, not by mobs, but by committees, by bureaucrats with lists. That is somehow worse. The mob is passion. The committee is intention. The women felt it first, the way water feels a change in temperature before anything else does. During the revolution, women had marched in their millions. They had organized, they had struck, they had faced tear gas and live rounds. Some had worn the hijab as a symbol of resistance against the Shah's forced westernization. But many had not. Many had marched bareheaded by choice as a statement of their own liberation. Within weeks of Khomeini's return, a decree came down. Women working in government offices must wear the veil. Then it extended further, then further still. On March the 8th, 1979, International Women's Day, tens of thousands of women poured into the streets of Tehran to protest. They chanted, they refused, They stood in the cold with their hair uncovered and their voices raw. And the Revolutionary Guards looked at them, and the new government looked at them, and the machinery of the new state looked at them, and it ground forward anyway. The protests were dispersed, the decree held. The women who had helped make the revolution found themselves, within weeks of its victory, among its first conquered subjects. Think about what that felt like. You spend years fighting a king who told you how to dress, how to think, how to be. You win. And within a month, a new authority tells you how to dress, how to think, how to be. The cage is the same shape, only the lock has changed. The left held on longer because they still had guns. The Mujahedin-e-Khalq, the MEK, were a Marxist Islamic hybrid organization that had fought the Shah with genuine ferocity. They had members who had been tortured in Savat's prisons and come out still fighting. They believed they had earned a place in the new Iran. The Fedayeen were secular Marxists, committed to a workers' revolution, suspicious of clerical power from the start. Both groups watched the clerical consolidation with growing alarm. Both groups began to organize resistance. Khomeini did not hesitate. The revolutionary courts moved against them with breathtaking speed. Arrests came first, then trials that lasted hours, sometimes minutes, then executions. The first wave targeted former officials of the Shah's regime, which drew little protest. The second wave targeted liberals who had questioned clerical authority. The third wave targeted the left, openly and without apology. By 1981, the MEK had launched an armed insurgency. The government responded with mass executions. Thousands of political prisoners were killed, not in secret. The regime announced it. Khomeini called them monafekin, hypocrites, enemies of God, and the revolutionary courts obliged. Sadegh Gulbudzadeh had been one of Khomeini's closest advisors in Paris during the exile years. He had sat at the old man's feet, translated his statements for Western journalists, helped build the international image of the revolution as a movement for freedom and justice. He returned to Iran as a hero. He served as foreign minister. And then, in 1982, he was arrested on charges of plotting against the Islamic Republic. He was executed. His former mentor signed off on it without visible emotion. That is not a metaphor. That is a man. That is a specific man who gave years of his life to a cause, who helped bring a leader to power, who was then killed by that leader. The revolution was not eating its children as a figure of speech. It was doing it by name, with paperwork at dawn against a wall. And then, as if the internal purges were not enough, the world intervened. On November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They took 66 American diplomats and staff hostage. The students called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's Lime. They believed, not without reason, that the embassy had been a hub of CIA activity that had helped orchestrate the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. They were settling a historical account. But the account they opened that day would cost Iran enormously. Bazargan's government, already weakened, collapsed within days of the takeover. Khomeini endorsed the seizure publicly. The hostages stayed for 444 days. The United States froze Iranian assets. Diplomatic relations shattered. The international community recoiled. And Iran found itself almost completely isolated, its economy strangled, its reputation in ruins, its moderates politically destroyed, and its hardliners strengthened by the confrontation with the Great Satan. The hostage crisis did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a country that was simultaneously trying to write a constitution, suppress internal dissent, rebuild its military after the Shah's officer corps had been gutted by purges, and manage a revolutionary economy that was hemorrhaging. The smell of those months was diesel and anxiety, the exhaust of government cars moving through checkpoints, the sweat of men with guns standing at every corner in a city that had not yet decided what it was. The crisis ended in January of 1981, the same day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as American president. The timing was not coincidental, though the full story of back-channel negotiations remained disputed for decades. The hostages came home, the damage to Iran remained, and then, before the country could breathe, Iraq invaded. On September 22, 1980, Saddam Hussein's army crossed the Iranian border. Saddam had calculated, not unreasonably, that Iran was at its most vulnerable. The military had been purged of experienced officers. The new Revolutionary Guards were ideologically committed but untested. The country was diplomatically isolated. The economy was strained. He expected a quick victory, a renegotiation of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, perhaps the annexation of Khuzestan with its Arab population and its vast oil fields. He was catastrophically wrong about the speed. He was right about the chaos. The first weeks of the war were a disaster for Iran. Iraqi forces pushed deep into Khuzestan. The city of Khorramshahr, a major port, fell after brutal street-by-street fighting that lasted over a month. Iranian soldiers and volunteers fought with desperate courage and were overwhelmed by Iraqi armor and air power. The ground smelled of crude oil and blood. The two things that had defined this land for centuries now mixed together in the worst possible way. But Iran did not collapse. It mobilized. Khomeini called the war a gift from God, a chance for the Islamic Republic to prove itself, to forge its identity in fire, to create the kind of revolutionary generation that could sustain the new order for decades. Young men were recruited in vast numbers. Many were barely teenagers. The Revolutionary Guards handed out plastic keys, cheap little things, and told the boys they were keys to paradise, that if they died in battle, they would enter heaven directly. Thousands of them walked into minefields to clear paths for advancing troops, on purpose, with those keys around their necks. Let that sit for a moment. 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, walking into minefields because a government told them God was waiting on the other side. This is what ideological power at its most total looks like. This is what happens when an authority controls not just the law and the gun, but the meaning of death itself. By 1982, Iran had pushed Iraqi forces back across the border. The war could have ended there. Saddam had failed. A negotiated peace was possible. Khomeini refused it. He declared that the war would not end until Saddam Hussein's regime fell and an Islamic Republic was established in Iraq. He turned a defensive war into an offensive crusade, and the dying continued. The war lasted 8 years. 8 years of trench warfare, poison gas, human wave attacks, and aerial bombardment. Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian troops repeatedly and openly. The international community, which was quietly supporting Saddam as a counterweight to Iranian revolutionary power, said little. The United States provided Iraq with intelligence. Western companies sold Iraq the precursors for chemical weapons. And Iranian soldiers died in clouds of mustard gas and nerve agents, their lungs dissolving, their skin blistering, their bodies left in fields that smelled like almonds and rot. Inside Iran, the war transformed everything. Dissent became treason. Any criticism of the government's war strategy was reframed as support for the enemy. The press was brought under total control. Universities were closed for 2 years starting in 1980, reopening only after a cultural revolution had purged their faculties and rewritten their curricula in line with Islamic ideology. The intellectuals who had dreamed of a free Iran watched colleagues disappear into Evin prison. Some came out broken. Many did not come out at all. Evin prison sat in the hills north of Tehran, visible from parts of the city, a constant presence. Under the Shah, Savak had filled it with political prisoners. Under the Islamic Republic, it filled again. Different prisoners, same walls, same cold, same dark. The architecture of repression does not change with the government. Only the reasons written on the paperwork change. The women of Iran adapted and resisted in the ways available to them. The mandatory hijab became a site of constant negotiation. A centimeter of hair showing at the front, a brighter color than regulations technically permitted. Lipstick, small defiances, individually meaningless, collectively a refusal. The regime cracked down in waves, morality police in the streets, fines and arrests, then a brief relaxation, then another crackdown. The women never stopped pushing, but the law never stopped pushing back. The Mujahedin-e-Khalq, driven into exile and into open warfare with the regime, carried out a bombing campaign in 1981 that killed dozens of senior officials, including the president and the prime minister of the Islamic Republic. The regime's response was ferocious. Mass arrests, mass trials, mass executions. The political opposition inside Iran was effectively destroyed by the mid-1980s. What remained was exile, silence, or the grave. In the summer of 1988, as the war ground toward its end, Khomeini issued a fatwa. It ordered the execution of political prisoners who remained unrepentant in their opposition to the Islamic Republic. What followed was one of the most devastating episodes in modern Iranian history. Thousands of prisoners, many of whom had already served years of their sentences, were brought before hasty committees and asked a simple question: do you support the Islamic Republic? Those who hesitated or refused or were identified as leftists or MEK members were taken away and hanged. Estimates of the death toll range from several thousand to over 30,000. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The families were not told. Some families only found out years later when they stopped receiving the prison visits they had been allowed. When they went to ask why, they were told their children were gone. There is a specific sound to that kind of grief. It is not crying. It is the sound of a person standing in a government office, hearing words that their mind refuses to process, their body going very still, while something inside them breaks in a way that will never fully heal. That sound was heard in thousands of Iranian homes in the summer and autumn of 1988. Khomeini accepted the ceasefire with Iraq in July of that same year. He called it, publicly, more bitter than drinking poison. He had staked his revolution on total victory over Saddam. He had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives on that altar. And he had to swallow defeat. He died less than a year later, in June of 1989, leaving behind a country that was exhausted, isolated, traumatized, and ruled by a system that brooked no challenge to its authority. The numbers from the Iran-Iraq war are almost too large to process as human beings. Nearly 1 million dead between both sides. Iran alone lost somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 soldiers and civilians. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, many by chemical weapons whose effects lasted lifetimes. Entire cities in Khuzestan had been reduced to rubble. The economy had been devastated. The oil infrastructure, the very foundation of Iranian prosperity, had been badly damaged. And for all of this, the border returned almost exactly to where it had been in September of 1980. Not a meter of territory changed hands permanently. Not one political objective was achieved. 1 million people died to move a line on a map that ended up back where it started. And yet, the Islamic Republic had survived. That was, from Khomeini's perspective, the point. The war had done exactly what wars do for authoritarian governments. It had created an emergency that justified total control. It had given the regime a language of sacrifice and martyrdom that made dissent feel like betrayal. It had killed or imprisoned or exiled the opposition. It had forged a generation of veterans and war widows and bereaved parents who had given too much to the Islamic Republic to easily turn against it. The war had been a catastrophe for Iran. It had been a consolidation for the regime. The revolutionaries who had chanted in the streets in 1979 had wanted different things. The liberals had wanted democracy. The left had wanted economic justice. The religious nationalists had wanted sovereignty and dignity. They had all gotten the sovereignty. They had gotten the end of the Shah. They had gotten the humiliation of the United States. And they had gotten, in exchange for all of that, A government that imprisoned journalists, executed political opponents, forced women into compliance by law, closed universities when they asked inconvenient questions, and sent teenagers into minefields with plastic keys. The Shah's Savake had tortured and killed. So did the Islamic Republic's Revolutionary Guards and its courts. The Shah had enriched a small elite at the expense of the poor. The new order created its own elite, the Boniads, the revolutionary foundations that controlled vast portions of the economy with no public accountability. The Shah had suppressed political opposition. The new government suppressed it more thoroughly because it had better tools, deeper reach, and the added weapon of religious authority. To oppose the Shah was to oppose a king. To oppose Khomeini's state was to oppose God himself. That is a much heavier weight to lift. The intellectuals who survived, who had not been killed or imprisoned or driven into exile, lived with a particular kind of quiet devastation. They had believed in something. They had risked everything for it. They had seen friends die for it. And what had emerged from that sacrifice was not the free and just society they had imagined. It was a theocracy with a constitution that placed final authority not in the people, not in elected officials, but in the supreme leader, the Faqih, the guardian jurist. The very concept Khomeini had outlined in his lectures in Najaf in the early 1970s, when his students had listened, and some had believed, and some had doubted, and all of them had underestimated how completely he meant it. He meant every word of it. He always had. The tragedy is that the people who joined his revolution either did not read carefully enough, or believed they could moderate him, or told themselves the details could be worked out later. Later came. The details were not negotiable. By 1988, as the guns fell silent on the Iran-Iraq border, over 1 million people had died in a war that accomplished nothing except deepening Iran's isolation and cementing the regime's grip on power. The revolutionaries who had chanted death to the Shah were now living under a government that was, in many ways, more repressive than what came before. The difference was that this time, the repression came wrapped in the language of God, and that made it infinitely harder to resist. Khomeini died in June of 1989. He was buried in a frenzy of grief so vast, it became something else entirely, something frightening. Millions of Iranians pressed toward his coffin, wailing, tearing at their own clothes, at each other. The crowd was so dense that his body nearly fell from the hands of those carrying it. That image stayed with people, not as a memory of mourning, but as a warning about what happens when a nation pours everything it has into a single man. He was gone, but the machine he had built kept running. That was the design. Khomeini had not simply led a revolution. He had architected a system that could survive without him. The supreme leader position passed to Ali Khamenei, a cleric of considerably less religious stature, but considerably sharper political instinct. The Guardian Council remained. The Revolutionary Guards remained. The judiciary remained. Every institution that could override the will of elected officials remained exactly where Khomeini had placed it, like load-bearing walls that no future government could legally remove. And so Iran entered the 1990s carrying the full weight of everything that had happened. The war was over. The founder was dead. The country smelled of exhaustion, of old concrete and unfinished roads, and the particular staleness of a nation that had been running on pure adrenaline for a decade and had finally stopped. People wanted ordinary things: hospitals, jobs, bread that did not cost 3 times what it had cost the year before. They wanted to rebuild something, anything. The economy was in ruins. Sanctions from the West had been biting for years. The war had consumed resources on a scale that left entire sectors of society hollowed out. Tehran, a city of nearly 9 million people by that point, groaned under the pressure of population and poverty, and the daily friction of living inside a system that controlled what you wore, what you said, what music you could hear drifting from a window. The small pleasures of life had been legislated away one by one. What remained was the ideology. And ideology, it turns out, does not fill a stomach. Into this exhaustion stepped Mohammad Khatami. He was not what the system expected to win. In 1997, running for president, he spoke about civil society. He spoke about the rule of law. He spoke about dialogue between civilizations at a moment when Iran's relationship with the rest of the world was defined almost entirely by hostility. He smiled. He wore his clerical robes with a kind of ease that made him look less like an enforcer of doctrine and more like a professor who happened to believe deeply in something. Iranians, particularly young Iranians, looked at him and felt something they had not felt in a long time. Hope is a dangerous thing in a closed system, but they felt it anyway. Khatami won with nearly 70% of the vote. The margin was not a preference, it was a shout. Millions of Iranians, especially women and young people who had grown up entirely inside the Islamic Republic, voted not just for a candidate, but for the idea that the system could change from within, that the cage had a door, that someone had found the key. He had not found the key. There was no key. What Khatami discovered almost immediately was that the presidency of Iran was a title with a ceiling. He could speak, he could propose, he could inspire, but the institutions that actually controlled the levers of power, the Guardian Council, the judiciary, the supreme leader himself, answered to no election. They could not be voted out. They could not be pressured by popular mandate in any way that would force them to yield. When Khatami's reformist allies in parliament passed legislation expanding press freedoms, the Guardian Council struck it down. When newspapers began publishing investigative journalism that made the conservative establishment uncomfortable, those papers were shut. Their editors were arrested. Some of them disappeared into Evin Prison, that grey building on the edge of Tehran that had swallowed dissidents under the Shah and went on swallowing them under the Republic. Khatami watched this happen. He did not resign. He did not shout. He issued careful statements and continued to work within the system, believing or needing to believe that incremental pressure would eventually produce results. It did not. By the end of his 2 terms, the reformist project had been methodically dismantled. Not through a coup, not through violence, at least not primarily, through procedure, through the quiet, relentless application of institutional power by bodies that existed precisely to ensure that no elected government could ever fundamentally alter the direction of the state. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. What broke was the hope of an entire political generation. The students who had rallied for Khatami in 1997 graduated into an economy that could not absorb them. Iran had one of the youngest populations in the world and one of the highest rates of youth unemployment. Educated young Iranians with degrees in engineering and medicine and literature looked at their options and saw a narrowing corridor. You could conform, you could leave, or you could stay and carry the weight of a life lived in permanent low-grade resistance, finding small ways to breathe inside a system that monitored the size of your breaths. Many left. The brain drain from Iran in this period was staggering. Doctors, engineers, artists, academics, anyone with the means and the connections to find a life elsewhere. Tehran's streets still hummed with life, with the specific restless energy of a city that refuses to be entirely subdued. But the people who left took something with them that could not be replaced. Possibility, the sense that the future belonged to those who stayed. Then came Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. 2 terms, from 2005 to 2013, during which the reformist window did not just close, but was boarded shut. His government poured money into nationalist rhetoric and nuclear defiance, while the economy contracted under the pressure of intensified international sanctions. The sanctions were not surgical. They never are. They fell hardest on ordinary Iranians, on the cost of medicine and the price of imported goods and the value of a currency that seemed to lose ground every week. Nationalist pride made it impossible to simply capitulate. But pride does not pay rent. The election of 2009 cracked something open that could not be sealed again. When Ahmadinejad was declared the winner by margins that defied credibility, Iranians poured into the streets of Tehran wearing green, the color of the opposition movement that had gathered around Mir Hossein Mousavi. Millions of people, the largest protests since the revolution itself. They chanted, they marched, they held up their ink-stained fingers and asked a simple question: where did our votes go? The answer came not in words but in batons and bullets and mass arrests. The Green movement was crushed. Mousavi was placed under house arrest, where he remained for years. The young people who had filled those streets went back to their apartments carrying something new, not grief exactly, something harder than grief. The knowledge that the system would use any force necessary to preserve itself, and that the world would watch and issue statements and do nothing that mattered. They did not forget. They went home and they opened their laptops. Because here is what the architects of the Islamic Republic had not fully accounted for when they designed their system in the late 1970s. The internet. Social media. The ability of a 20-year-old in Tehran to watch a film made in Los Angeles, read a novel banned in Iran, talk to someone in Paris about what freedom felt like from the inside. The regime built firewalls, it blocked platforms, it created its own state-approved internet infrastructure. But the gaps were everywhere, and Iranians, who had been navigating restrictions for decades, were extraordinarily skilled at finding them. VPNs spread through friend networks like a second language. Satellite dishes sat on rooftops across the country, technically illegal, practically universal. A generation grew up with two realities operating simultaneously. The official reality, broadcast through state television with its particular blend of religious instruction and nationalist mythology. And the other reality, accessed through a screen, showing a world that looked nothing like what the official version described. The dissonance was not subtle, it was total, and it produced something the regime found genuinely difficult to manage, not open rebellion, something quieter and more corrosive. Indifference, a generation that had simply stopped believing. Hassan Rouhani arrived in 2013 carrying the same promise Khatami had carried 16 years earlier: a moderate, a pragmatist, a man who spoke about engagement with the world, about lifting sanctions through negotiation, about giving Iranians some relief from the economic pressure that had been grinding them down for years. He won. Iranians voted for him with the particular mix of hope and cynicism that had become the national emotional register. They hoped he could deliver something real. They also suspected he probably couldn't. They voted anyway because what else do you do? Rouhani's signature achievement was the nuclear deal of 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated with the United States and other world powers. For a moment, it felt like a genuine opening. Sanctions would ease. Iran would rejoin the global economy in at least a limited way. Young Iranians talked about foreign investment, about companies coming in, about the possibility of a normal economic life. Then the United States withdrew from the deal in 2018. Sanctions returned, harder than before. The economic relief that Rouhani had promised evaporated. The currency collapsed. Inflation ran at rates that made ordinary planning impossible. A family that had budgeted carefully for a year found that their savings had lost half their value. The price of eggs, of cooking oil, of the most basic necessities climbed week by week. Rouhani had done everything the system allowed him to do. He had negotiated. He had compromised. He had worked within the boundaries set by the supreme leader and the conservative institutions that surrounded the presidency like a moat. And in the end, external forces had undone the one thing he had managed to build. The lesson was not lost on Iranians. Even when the system produced a leader willing to try, even when that leader succeeded by the narrow measures available to him, the outcome could be destroyed by forces entirely outside anyone's control. The feeling of powerlessness was not new, but it was deepening. Protests broke out again in 2017 and again in 2019. These were not the organized green-scarfed marches of 2009. These were eruptions of economic fury, spreading from provincial cities rather than Tehran, driven by people who were not students or intellectuals but workers and shopkeepers, and anyone who had watched their standard of living erode year after year while officials spoke about resistance and sacrifice. And the enemies of Islam. The government's response was swift and brutal. In November of 2019, security forces killed hundreds of protesters in a matter of days. The internet was shut down entirely for almost 2 weeks. The darkness was not accidental, it was a strategy. You could not document what you could not transmit. Yet decade after decade, the same pattern repeated. Elections raised hopes. Reformists faced blockades from unelected conservative institutions. Disappointment followed, and Iranians settled back into a kind of exhausted acceptance. The revolution had promised liberation. What it delivered was a different kind of cage, one with more sophisticated locks and prettier propaganda. By 2020, a new generation of Iranians had never known anything except this stagnation. They didn't remember the Shah. They didn't remember the revolution. They only knew that the system promised change but could not deliver it. And that knowledge was becoming dangerous. That exhaustion you just heard about, that deepening sense of powerlessness, did not kill Iran. It transformed it. The reform cycles had failed. The Green Movement had been crushed. The moderates had been outmaneuvered. And yet something kept moving underneath the surface, the way water moves beneath ice in winter, invisible but relentless. A new generation had grown up inside the cage. And unlike their parents, they had no memory of building it. They felt no obligation to respect its locks. By the early 2020s, Iran held a population of over 92 million people. More than half of them were under 35. Think about what that means. Tens of millions of Iranians who had spent their entire conscious lives inside a system that promised them purpose and delivered them inflation, unemployment, and surveillance. They had watched their currency collapse. They had watched officials grow rich while lecturing about sacrifice. They had watched the internet get switched off when they tried to speak. And slowly, year by year, their patience had been replaced by something harder. The women moved first. Or rather, they moved most visibly. In September of 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by Iran's morality police in Tehran. She had been visiting the city with her brother. Her crime was wearing her hijab incorrectly. 3 days later, she was dead in a hospital bed. The authorities said she had suffered a heart attack. The photographs told a different story. Within days, women across Iran were standing in the streets, pulling off their headscarves and holding them in the air like flags. The smell of tear gas hung over Tehran, over Mashhad, over cities and towns that had never made international headlines before. The sound that rose from those streets was not a political chant at first. It was something rawer. It was grief that had decided it was done being quiet. The slogan was 3 words. Woman, life, freedom. It spread faster than the government could contain it. Young men joined the protests, standing alongside women, not as protectors, but as equals in fury. Schoolgirls chased officials out of their own schools. Protesters tore down portraits of the supreme leader in the streets. The regime responded the way it always responded, with arrests, with bullets, with internet blackouts. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were imprisoned, and still the protests continued for months, burning with an intensity that older Iranians said they had not felt since 1979 itself. The Islamic Republic survived, but it survived differently, more brittle, more afraid. And then, in December of 2025, it happened again, larger this time. The Iranian rial had collapsed. Inflation had eaten through savings that had already been eaten through before. Shortages of basic goods spread through cities that were already struggling. People who had accepted hardship for years reached the point where acceptance simply ran out. Protests erupted in more than 200 cities across the country. It became the largest uprising Iran had seen since the revolution itself. The government cracked down with everything it had. The outcome remained unresolved even as the rest of this story was being told. What do you do with a nation that keeps erupting and keeps being suppressed over and over for decade after decade? You don't call it failure, you call it persistence. Because here is the other Iran, the one that exists alongside the protests and the crackdowns and the sanctions and the suffering. Iran's regional influence, even as its economy deteriorated, had expanded dramatically. Iranian-backed forces operated in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. The Islamic Republic had built a web of alliances and proxy relationships across the Middle East that made it one of the most consequential powers in the region, regardless of what the economy looked like at home. Sanctions had not broken the system. They had squeezed it, deformed it, pushed it toward self-sufficiency in some sectors and toward corruption and black markets in others. But the Islamic Republic was still standing, still projecting force, still influencing events far beyond its borders. This is the paradox that makes Iran so difficult to understand from the outside. A government can be simultaneously oppressive at home and powerful abroad. A nation can be economically strangled and still geopolitically significant. These things are not contradictions. They are the texture of a complicated reality. And underneath all of it, Iran kept making things. Beautiful, aching, defiant things. Iranian cinema became one of the most celebrated in the world, precisely because it learned to say everything while appearing to say nothing. Directors like Abbas Kiarostami and Asghar Farhadi found ways to hold the full weight of Iranian life, its tenderness, its moral complexity, its quiet suffocations, inside films that passed the censors and broke hearts in theaters from Paris to Tokyo. Iranian poets kept writing. Iranian novelists kept publishing, sometimes inside the country, sometimes in exile, sometimes in both places at once, with different names on different covers. Iranian women kept painting and composing and designing, finding in art the freedoms that the law refused to grant them. A civilization that had been producing poetry and philosophy for more than 2,500 years was not going to stop because a government told it to. The history of Iran is, in the end, a history of continuity that has survived extraordinary disruption. We began this story in the deep past, on the Iranian plateau, where the first settlements took shape thousands of years before anyone imagined a Persian empire. We watched Cyrus build something the ancient world had never seen, a multi-ethnic empire that let conquered peoples keep their gods. We watched Alexander shatter it and the idea survive him. We watched the Parthians and the Sassanids rebuild Persian identity from the ruins of conquest. We watched Islam arrive and transform Iran so thoroughly that within 2 centuries, Iranians had made Islam their own, bending the new faith around an ancient culture rather than being dissolved by it. We watched the Mongols burn Nishapur until the very cats and dogs were killed. We watched the Safavids rise from that ash and build a Shia state so durable that its borders still roughly define Iran today. We watched the Qajars lose pieces of territory, one humiliation at a time, to empires that saw Iran as a board to play on rather than a nation to respect. We watched the constitutional revolution of 1905 produce a parliament that was strangled before it could breathe. We watched Reza Shah seize modernity by force and his son lose it to a CIA operation that took 40 minutes to plan and 40 years to fully understand. We watched the revolution come, white-hot and certain of itself, and we watched it harden into something its own founders no longer recognized. And now we stand here, at the edge of the known, looking at a country in motion. The question of what comes after the Islamic Republic is genuinely unresolved. Not because analysts haven't tried to answer it, because history itself hasn't answered it yet. The regime has proven more durable than almost anyone predicted in 1979, in 2009, in 2022. It has survived a catastrophic war with Iraq, decades of sanctions, multiple mass uprisings, and the death of its founding generation. The institutions it built, the Revolutionary Guards, the Guardian Council, the Supreme Leader's Office, have developed interests of their own powerful enough to outlast any single individual. But institutions built on suppression carry a specific kind of fragility. They can hold enormous pressure for a very long time, and then they can't. The ice looks solid until the morning it doesn't. What the protests of the last decade have revealed is not just anger. It is the emergence of a different Iran, one that is not waiting for a savior, not looking for a Mossadegh or a Khomeini to crystallize its hopes into a single figure. The women who pulled off their headscarves in 2022 were not following a leader. They were leading themselves. The workers who poured into the streets in 2025 were not organized by a party. They were organized by the shared experience of a system that had stopped pretending to serve them. That is new. Or rather, it is very old, returned in a new form. Cyrus built his empire on a principle that was radical for its time. That you could hold a vast, diverse, complicated people together, not by erasing their differences, but by making space for them. The Persians never forgot that idea, even when their rulers did. It moved through the culture like a thread through cloth, surfacing in poetry, in architecture, in the peculiar Iranian habit of holding contradictory truths simultaneously and refusing to choose between them. The Iran that exists today carries all of it. The weight of empire and the memory of subjugation. The pride of a civilization that gave the world Rumi and Hafez and the first declaration of human rights, and the grief of a century in which that civilization was repeatedly denied the chance to govern itself on its own terms. The revolutionary generation and the post-revolutionary generation. The Iranians inside the country and the millions in diaspora who carry Iran with them across every continent, who argue about it at dinner tables in Los Angeles and Toronto and London, who write about it and film it and grieve it and love it from a distance. All of that is Iran, all of it at once. The Islamic Republic will not be the last chapter. No system built on the fear of its own people has ever been the last chapter. But what replaces it when it changes, whether through collapse or transformation or something no one has yet imagined, will be shaped by everything that came before. By Cyrus and Darius, by the Arab conquest and the Persian Renaissance, by Safavid theology and Qajar humiliation, by the constitutional revolution that almost was, by Mossadegh who tried and was destroyed, by the revolution that promised everything and delivered a different kind of control, by every protest that was suppressed and every poem that survived the suppression. Iran's history is not a story of decline or triumph, but of continuation, of a civilization that has survived empires, invasions, revolutions, and revolutions against revolutions. What comes next remains unwritten. But whatever future emerges from Iran will be written not by kings or clerics or ideologues, but by millions of ordinary Iranians who have learned through bitter experience that history is not destiny. It is a weight to be carried, questioned, and sometimes slowly, painfully transformed. The throne has trembled before. It may tremble again. And when it does, the world will be watching a nation whose story has never been finished, because Iran itself has never been finished rewriting itself.